In times of war, words matter. They shape how we see violence, how we rationalize suffering, and how we categorize human lives into the worthy and the expendable. What's most striking is that some of the most intelligent and articulate people, media personalities, philosophers, authors, and commentators, use their intellect not to challenge power, but to justify war. Today we'll examine how figures like Piers Morgan, Sam Harris, Konstantin Kisin, Thomas Friedman, Ben Shapiro, Douglas Murray, and Bill Maher defend Israel's war effort and, directly or indirectly, the killing of Palestinians. We'll look beyond these sound bites and dissect the rhetorical strategies of dehumanization, propaganda, historical revisionism, euphemisms, and ideological framing. Because intelligence is no safeguard against selective reasoning. In fact, it can make propaganda all the more persuasive. One of the most effective tools of war rhetoric is dehumanization, reducing people to abstractions, enemies, or statistics. Sam Harris provides a striking example. In a 2023 essay, he argued, Gaza is only an open-air prison because its democratically elected government is a jihadist organization bent on the destruction of Israel.
Gaza is only a, quote, open-air prison because its democratically elected government is a jihadist organization that is eager to martyr all Palestinians for the pleasure of killing Jews.
At first glance, this sounds like political analysis, but it's coming from someone who's better known for meditation applications than for political know-how. But the framing here is crucial. By attributing Gaza's suffering to their choice of government, Harris transfers collective guilt onto civilians, including children who never voted. The result is moral flattening. Palestinians become indistinguishable from Hamas. This is how civilian death is rationalized, not as tragedy, but as consequence. Harris isn't a fringe voice here. He's a neuroscientist and philosopher known for clarity of thought. But clarity here becomes a scalpel, cutting away empathy by suggesting that Palestinians authored their own misery. This is how intelligence, when wielded selectively, sanitizes atrocity. Another dimension is authoritative indoctrination, where mainstream media amplifies state narratives. Piers Morgan, the British broadcaster, often echoes the line of defense. After October 7th, he declared Israel has the right to defend itself against these barbaric terrorist acts, and repeatedly continued to do so thereafter.
I believe, given the scale of what Hamas did on October the 7th, Israel is entitled to
kill
defend.
children.
No, that's not what I said.
Go ahead.
They're entitled to defend themselves with force.
Okay.
This phrasing has been echoed by presidents, prime ministers, and UN delegates. It functions like a mantra. Yet notice what disappears: the history of occupation, blockade, and displacement. The phrase establishes Israel as a victim and Palestinians as aggressors, resetting the timeline at the moment of Israeli suffering. Morgan's authority as a household media figure means his words don't just report reality, they frame reality. When millions hear right to defend itself, they're less likely to question proportionality, legality, or the humanity of the victims. Indoctrination doesn't always look like propaganda posters. Sometimes it looks like polished talk show dialogue, repeated until it feels like common sense. And the framing of reality truly matters. The language of defense can be used to justify nearly any act of aggression. Douglas Murray, the conservative British writer, put it bluntly: anything short of victory is defeat, and we can't afford a defeat. Here, victory is defined as the total eradication of Hamas. But the ambiguity blurs the line between combatants and civilians. If Hamas is embedded within Gaza, then victory implies destruction of Gaza itself. Murray's statement reframes mass civilian death not as collateral damage, but as logical necessity.
Israel is given an utterly unsolvable problem and then condemned when it does not solve it. Win, lose. No clearer choice.
This is how defense morphs into justification for disproportionate violence. Murray's reputation as a sharp polemicist gives these words weight. They're not shouted from the fringes, but delivered in articulate, Oxford-educated tones. That veneer of sophistication is what makes the framing so effective. Genocide is never announced as genocide, but as security. Another tactic is historical revisionism, selective memory that legitimizes present violence. Thomas Friedman, longtime New York Times columnist, has argued in op-eds that Hamas's violence has left Israel with no choice but to strike Gaza hard. In one column, he rationalized there is no moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas.
So Hamas, the Palestinian side, is being driven by the worst of the worst, and we saw that reflected on October 7th with things I'd never seen before. Mass rape, the maiming of people, shooting parents in front of their kids and kids in front of their parents, kidnapping 2-year-olds and 4-year-olds and grandparents. And so it's being driven by the worst of the worst on the Palestinian side. It's being driven by the worst of the worst on the Israeli side. I don't compare them. These are not people who engaged in rape or that kind of blatant barbarous murder.
This is a very powerful line, but it's also deeply revisionist. By erasing Israel's decades-long military occupation, settlement expansion, and repeated bombardments, Friedman presents the conflict as unidirectional. Israel as reluctant actor, Hamas as sole aggressor. History is compressed, decades of suffering are omitted, and a one-sided narrative is cemented. Friedman has shaped US foreign policy debates for decades. His voice doesn't just reflect the establishment, it reinforces it, providing intellectual cover for war by smoothing over messy historical realities. I really do appreciate you taking the time and watching the Kandari Chronicles. Please do join our community by subscribing so that you don't miss out on any content regarding the Arab and Muslim history, identity, and modern condition. And if you really do enjoy the channel week in and week out and would like to support us even further, please do join us at our YouTube membership program as well as on Patreon. Thanks again. Strategically, language can be utilized in a very obscure manner. Euphemisms and coded language transform death into policy. Bill Maher once remarked during the Lebanon War, if terrorists took over Canada and started shelling us, the president would nuke them before breakfast.
In the Gaza Strip, they fired 10,000 rockets at Israel in the last few years, and they are avowed to destroy this country. If the United States, if Quebec was firing rockets into our territory and was sworn to wipe us off the face of the earth, do you think we would just be having an embargo against them? I mean, talk about overreaction. I think we would have nuked them 100 times by now.
Notice how this sidesteps the image of charred civilians or leveled neighborhoods. The word nuke becomes shorthand for swift justice, not annihilation. By using hypothetical analogies, Maher reframes actual death as a thought experiment. Detached, almost comical. Euphemisms like surgical strikes, collateral damage, or eliminating terror infrastructure perform the same function. They allow atrocities to be discussed in polite company. When comedians and talk show hosts use such language, they normalize the unimaginable. For the likes of Ben Shapiro, the justification of war is rooted in ideology. In public debates, he has insisted Hamas must be destroyed, period. The absolutism is telling. By reducing the conflict to a binary, destroy Hamas or face annihilation, Shapiro positions any call for restraint as moral weakness. In this framing, civilian casualties are not ignored, but subordinated. Unfortunate, yes, but irrelevant to the greater ideological struggle.
Israel has a moral duty, which it absolutely does, to protect its own citizenry by eviscerating that terrorist group from the planet.
This is classic state logic, legitimizing atrocity through appeals to survival. Shapiro's large following means this logic reaches millions, embedding the idea that mass violence is not only permissible, but virtuous. Konstantin Kisin, co-host of the Trigonometry podcast, represents a different rhetorical role, the intellectual everyman. After October 7, he tweeted, Israel has the right to do whatever it takes to eliminate Hamas. The language of whatever it takes is both vague and dangerous. It absolves Israel of limits, implying that international law, proportionality, or humanitarian concerns are secondary. Kisin presents himself as reasonable and centrist, yet this very reasonableness masks the extremity of the position.
I hope we would be as careful as Israel, but I don't think we would be. Is the truth of it. I don't think we would be as careful. I don't think we would be as the ratio of civilians to combatants killed would be anything like what it is now.
The everyman persona is powerful. When intellectuals pose as common sense truth tellers, their selective analysis feels accessible, persuasive, and almost apolitical. But this is precisely how ideology seeps into mainstream consciousness, through the guise of ordinary reason. Let's pause for a second and summarize these patterns. Across different figures, from talk show hosts to philosophers, we hear the same tropes repeated. Israel has the right to defend itself, a mantra that resets history and absolves context. Hamas must be destroyed, a call that blurs the line between militants and civilians. There is no moral equivalence, a phrase that erases decades of dispossession and injustice. Whatever it takes, a blank check for mass violence and inhumane action. Proportionality is a joke, a dismissal of international law. These aren't arguments in a vacuum. They are rhetorical weapons deployed by intelligent voices to make atrocity appear rational and even necessary. Perhaps the most unsettling element in this discourse is not simply the context of the arguments, but the unshakable belief these intellectuals display in the official Israeli narrative. Figures like Sam Harris, Bill Maher, and Piers position themselves as skeptics in almost every other arena of public debate, critical of religion, of governments, of populist rhetoric. Yet, when it comes to Israel, they suddenly suspend disbelief, no matter the evidence of state misconduct. From illegal settlements to collective punishment to the repeated killing of civilians, they rarely question the integrity of the Israeli government. This posture borders on naivety. How can sharp, worldly commentators fail to recognize that Israel, more than every other state, lies, manipulates, and pursues its interests with absolute moral compromise? To present its claims as if they are beyond scrutiny suggests either ignorance or willful blindness. In this way, these thinkers appear less as independent minds and more as loyal echo chambers for state propaganda. It is here that their intelligence becomes most troubling, because if educated, influential figures willingly place their trust in a government with a track record of concealment and brutality, they validate that government's actions for millions of followers. Their uncritical faith does not only betray Palestinian lives, it betrays the very intellectual values of skepticism and inquiry they claim to champion. At the heart of this issue lies not only selective reasoning, but also the deeper forces of influence and power. The positions taken by these media personalities, authors, and intellectuals cannot be divorced from the realities of professional survival and financial backing. Speaking against the Israeli state narrative comes with immense risk, potential loss of media platforms, publishing opportunities, and funding. Thus, their wavering repetition of slogans like Israel has a right to defend itself or Hamas must be destroyed functions as a safe script, one that ensures their careers remain intact. But it's not merely a matter of fear or pragmatism. In many cases, these figures genuinely subscribe to the same inhumane ideological frameworks that underpin Zionist justifications for violence. Whether through deep-seated Islamophobia, a colonial mindset, or sheer loyalty to Western geopolitical interests, these personalities align themselves with a worldview that normalizes Palestinian suffering as collateral damage. Their intelligence, instead of fostering critical thought, becomes an instrument of reinforcement for state propaganda. This is why their voices carry such weight in shaping public opinion. When the intelligentsia parrots state-sanctioned narratives, it cloaks atrocity in legitimacy, offering moral cover for policies of displacement, siege, and mass killing. The tragedy is not only in what is said, but in what is deliberately unsaid. The humanity of Palestinians, the illegitimacy of occupation, and the immorality of collective punishment. Ultimately, the intellectual defense of Israeli actions is not only rooted in fear of losing influence and financial support, but disturbingly in an acceptance or even embrace of an ideology that dehumanizes an entire people. Time will tell when these personalities will be judged and found wanting. Eventually, the truth of their selective reasoning and moral compromises will outlast their influence, and their voices, once amplified by wealth and platforms, will fall silent, leaving history to speak for the lives they helped marginalize.